Wow, thank you, Dr. Ergi. I have my own experience with mental health through my daughter, Crystal, and when you were talking about depression. My name is Michele Nelson, and this is about my story about caring about my daughter with a mental health condition. So I've lived long enough to know how to use a rotary phone and drive a car with a stick shift. But it turns out I didn't learn much about mental health in that time. But then I had my two wonderful, beautiful daughters, and I learned a lot about a lot of things I didn't know I needed to know, including mental illness and how shame and denial hurt. It took me 40 years before I had the courage to do what I love, and that's writing. I've been a reporter with the Payson Roundup for the last 13 years, and for half that time I covered this school district. But my daughter led me to my second great passion, helping to end the stigma, fear, and denial that surrounds mental health. The problems she faced finding a diagnosis and treatment, and the ways in which I contributed to making that more difficult, prompted me to become the Gila County Ending the Silence program specialist for the Arizona chapter of the National Alliance of Mental Illness. The in-class series of presentations that I now facilitate help students with mental illness to understand what's happening to them. But more important, it helps their friends and family to understand how they can help. I just learned those lessons the hard way when my daughter began to change. Just a few years ago, she just about lived on that stage. Sometimes she was a percussion, she tried percussion, she was a flute player, she sang in the choir, she performed in plays. In fact, she was the lead of The Little Mermaid. She adored science and she took every biology class she could. She's gifted. But for her, that came packaged with the genes for bipolar disorder and ADHD. At 14, she started showing the first signs of her mental health condition, but that's not surprising. Research has found half of mental health conditions show up by the age of 14. But I wasn't ready, because my family comes from a long line of farmers. My parents were the first in generations to go to college, and they both became teachers. In fact, my dad became a math teacher, and come to think of it, that's why I love writing. But on the farm, you don't talk about feelings, and you don't talk about being scared, and you certainly don't talk about mental health. And actually, you don't talk about mental health in math class either. So when I saw scratch marks on Crystal's wrists, I was terrified. And when she started talking about her suicide ideation, I felt shame. I did everything I could to keep her quiet about her suicidal thoughts, because how could my child be this damaged? What did I do? Was it my fault? I thought, surely my child, no way, she couldn't have mental illness. But she kept telling me she hurt. She kept telling everyone from friends to teachers to our family that she hurt. And finally, reluctantly, I looked for help. For a year and a half, we talked to counselors. We visited psychiatrists, mostly on a computer screen, but that's not surprising. There are less than 2,000 psychiatrists practicing in the state of Arizona, and not one adolescent psychiatrist practices in rural Arizona. Some said she was depressed. One said she had autism. So finally, she talked about her growing thoughts of suicide in front of a psychiatric nurse. I was shocked. But that's when I realized I couldn't be in denial about this any longer. The nurse told me once a patient threatens harm to themselves or someone else in front of a mental health professional, they must send them to a psychiatric hospital by force or voluntarily. We chose voluntarily. After a frantic search under the guidance of the insurance company, she ended up in a lovely facility in Phoenix. In a twist of fate, a fellow classmate checked in that same night. She spent this next week trying to understand what she was feeling, while I spent the same week explaining why my straight A, music and science loving student was in a psych unit. It just didn't add up. But that's the nature of bipolar. My daughter would lay in bed for a week avoiding a huge project, and then she'd stay up all night to finish it. She taught herself how to do stop-motion animation one night for a physics project, and then in another, she composed songs and a lyric for a biology project. Since then, we have learned that bipolar is incredibly difficult to diagnose with the help of her psychiatrist. It's also one of the most challenging to treat. In fact, the hospital stay was the first reasonable diagnosis we received, depression with psychosis. But a fit of teenage urges resulted in behavior I'd never seen in my daughter. That hormonal charged crisis tipped the scales towards bipolar with the help of her Valley-based adolescent psychiatrist. You see, bipolar comes in all sorts of ranges. My daughter happens towards the depression side of it. But we learned if you only treat the depression, that pops out the mania, and it's quite crazy making for a parent. Fortunately, my support group, mainly my second husband, got me through it during her high school years. I set aside my shame and blame. After all, if she had diabetes, I wouldn't feel shame, I'd just get her help. But mental health is different for us parents. It just hits different, and I've heard other parents tell me this too. My family had taught me it was all in her head, and that's true, but that doesn't mean it's not real. But let's give my family a break. I mean, we didn't know what was really going on up here until the 1990s when we could see things with our MRI and our technology. I've learned all about that from classes at NAMI Payson. They taught me that two things create a mental health condition. First, you need the genetic predisposition, and then you need a trigger, a trauma, a challenge, a loss. I'm still learning about triggers. Sometimes an injury or an illness becomes a trigger. Sometimes it's abuse. Sometimes it's some other trauma, like the pandemic. This journey with my daughter and her bipolar and ADHD disorders will never end. We have been through some major depressive episodes, including the pandemic. In fact, just this January, she came home again and crawled into bed for a month. I've come to accept this will happen throughout her life. She will fall into depression, she'll come home, we'll keep her safe, we'll get her sleep, she'll get good mom food, we'll take walks, and remind her that self-care is at the core of her whole body health. It never fails. She gets back on track to go out into the world armed and restored, despite the shame and prejudice around mental health. She's never let her condition define her. She finished her college degree. She became a geologist. She worked for a company looking for lithium. And now she's about to start another job making probably twice as much as I'm making. She's living her dream, even though she has had to adjust and adapt so she can function in the world. By coming here today, you have started on this journey that most of us will take, supporting a loved one who lives with a mental health condition. Because the CDC has found only 20% of the US population has what needs for a mental health condition. The rest of the 80% are friends and family. But don't forget, even those who see someone speaking into the wind at a street corner can help if they know what to do. There are some things to help with that goal. You can talk to a teacher, a school counselor, or administrator about how to get the Ending the Silence program into the schools. Southwest Behavioral is an excellent place for families to start the process of learning about mental health. They help to decide if and what kind of mental health condition a child might have. Or consider taking a NAMI Payson class. They've completely changed my relationship with my daughter. I will say something based off of something I've learned in a NAMI class, and my daughter will get misty-eyed and say, "I can't tell you how long I've waited for you to say that." People with a mental health condition have so much to offer. But it's for us to lose our cultural shame so we can allow them to live their best life. Thank you for coming out today to learn about people like my daughter. You give me hope.